All right, let's party. We're going to talk fast and code faster. One last check. If you want to get in on the code on this, it's up on the screen here. 5, 4, 3, 2, last chance. Here we go. Welcome to Callbacks, Events, and More, bringing Sanity to your asynchronous lightning code. I'm going to be your tour guide for today. My name's Tom Petros. I'm the CTO and founder of Red Argyle. We're a boutique Salesforce consulting and development shop founded in 2010. We work with companies of all sizes to solve business process, integration, and user experience challenges on the Salesforce platform. So, here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Lightning components. If you've built them, great. If you haven't, that's cool. You're going to learn some stuff. We're going to talk about how to never have to write A.enqueueAction ever again through the help of a proxy component. We're also going to talk about how callbacks compile up and turn into callback hell really easily. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the existential crisis about component events versus application events and how to use each one and when. All that in 20 minutes or less, I hope. So in this session, we'll talk about callbacks, what they are, how to use them, how to make them more efficient with a proxy component, talk about events, what they are and how to use them. We'll look at a lot of code. And I'm going to use the term flatness quite a bit throughout this session, because I think flatness is really what we're all looking for as developers. It's a methodology or a concept to develop in a consistent, low-friction, repeatable way that all of our teammates can understand. AKA, don't bury all of your code inside of other code that buries code, that passes code, that passes code, that buries code. Here's the code one more time. And there it goes. So, what is a callback? Well, in the simplest terms that I can comprehend, a callback is a function that you pass to another function that gets called later. Sometimes you can pass parameters to that function if you want. And the nice thing about that callback function is it remembers the context of the thing that called it, which is really cool because you don't have to pass a bunch of crap in and out of your functions. It just remembers it. I explained that to my 7-year-old and he seemed to get it, so we'll go with it. The most frequent callback that you all know and love if you're writing Lightning components is $enqueueAction. This is an Aura framework method that basically lets Lightning talk to Apex. It's how Lightning talks to Apex code. It's an action parameter that gets passed in that is the callback that will come back from your Apex code. Let's take a look because that's a lot easier to show than to talk about. So here's I've got an example on screen which I'm going to call the simple callback. It's a very basic Lightning component. We've got an Apex controller here. We won't go into a lot of detail. Just assume that every Lightning component's got an Apex controller and it passes some stuff back, so we don't have to thrash through a whole bunch of screens today. All this is going to do is make a call out, get the callback, and fill an attribute on my component. Controller of this Lightning component, not much going on. If you saw the last session, they recommended don't put a bunch of stuff in here. Put it in put your client side stuff in your controller. Put your helper side or your server side stuff in your helper. So we're doing that here. We're just passing an init function down into our helper, which is where the magic happens. So within my init function in my helper is where I'm going to go make my call out to Apex. This is you will see this code over and over again. I'm going to go get the Apex method that is in the controller attached to this Lightning component. I'm going to specify this callback, which basically sits and listens for state returned from the Apex method. So there's a couple of different states that come back. We're not going to care about all of them. We're going to try to be really optimistic and assume that our Apex code is always successful, because why wouldn't it be? But in the rare occasion that we write some bad code, we might get an error back as well. So when I make a call out, I wrap up my callback, expecting states to come back. Ideally, if everything's good, I get the response back from the Apex, from the server, from the Apex code as my value here, and I can go do with it what I want. If I have an error, well, I can panic and do something, or just be really lazy in my case and write it to the console log and pretend nothing ever happened. The magic is down here at the bottom, which is where we actually call enqueueAction with all that stuff up above. It makes the call out, triggers everything. We asynchronously twiddle our thumbs till we get our callback, and everything is good. Now, that's a really simple example. Let's look at a less ideal example. This is my callback hell component. It's got a callback hell controller with a bunch of methods that take stuff back. I'm just still going to fill some attributes. Don't get carried away about what the Apex controller actually does. The controller of the Lightning component. Anybody read Dante's Inferno? We're going to go down, not 7 layers, but we'll go 3 layers of hell today. So we'll begin our descent with a call into my helper. to make the first callback. Same thing as the last component. I'm calling the method, writing up my callback, waiting for a response to come back. I'll set an attribute on the Lightning component, and then I'll do it all over again. I'll make a second action, make another call out, wait for my response to come back, and why not? Let's do it all over again. We'll make a third call out and wait for a response to come back, and just basically bury ourselves 3 levels deep in callback hell. If you flip this on its side, kind of looks like a pyramid, which I hear is pretty cool and important in the news right now. There's some hole in a pyramid in Egypt. So this kind of sucks because we're writing the same thing over and over again, right? We don't want to do that. Let's find a better way to do this. Back to the slides. So those enqueueActions really start to pile up, but in the end they all do the same thing over and over again. They call an Apex method with parameters, handle the success or the failure as an outcome. It's pretty repeatable, right? So how do we wrap that all up? Let's write another component that our components can call, which I like to call a proxy component. Introducing Apex Proxy. The purpose of Apex Proxy is not to render anything. It's just to serve as a utility to make it easier to call in and out of Apex so you don't have to write all that boilerplate code over and over again. We've got some events here at the top, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But what I want to focus on here first is this aura method that is exposed through this component. For those that aren't familiar with aura methods, think of it as a really small, lightweight way to kind of give your component an API. Essentially let some other component call the method within that component to go do stuff for you. In this case, our call method takes a bunch of parameters that probably look kind of similar to what we're passing to our enqueueAction call. We're going to pass it the actual Apex method that we want to run. We're going to pass it the parameters that that Apex method expects. And then we're going to pass, to start, we'll pass a couple of functions to manage the success or failure of the call out. Later, we'll pass some details about how to have events actually handle those results. Not much in the controller again. We just have to define our call method, which is exposed by our aura method. And one last time, hopefully the last time I ever have to write enqueueAction logic again, within my call method in the helper, from basically line 15 down. You've all seen this and no one love it or hate it. But up above, what we're getting is all of those arguments from our aura method that we're going to pass in dynamically to our Apex proxy code, which is then going to go make the calls. Let's see what that looks like before we dig into the guts of Apex proxy. I've got an example component here which consumes my Apex proxy. Again, a controller, don't freak out, there's code there, it's going to return stuff. This is what we care about. This is an instance of Apex proxy inside of another component, so this component can consume it. Giving it a name is important because we want to go find it once we get into our controller and helper code. Not much going on in this component. Again, just want to initialize it and pass some stuff off to the helper. And inside of our init and our helper, here, we're going to go find that Apex proxy component that we just added to our page. Here, we're going to go tell it the Apex method that we want it to run, which if you, we look here, that's the controller, and the method that we're getting is this one right here. I'm going to pass it some parameters. Keep your key values and pairs in mind, because when I pass the parameters like this, if the Apex method wants a string, give it a string. If it wants a Boolean, give it a Boolean. If it wants a number, you get the idea. But make sure they line up in the sequence that you're going to pass them in. And then finally, I'm going to make that call, terrible name, sorry. I'm going to call the call and pass in all those parameters that I built up to this point. The Apex method that I want to call, the parameters that Apex method expects. If successful, here's my callback function on success. If it fails, here's my callback function on error. Now what does that all look like inside the proxy itself? These were all the parameters that we passed it. Boilerplate, never mind these events, we'll come back to that, just avert your eyes. Boilerplate stuff for enqueueAction and set callback. And then, where we get a little different, is in here. So, we're not going to do anything in this code. We're going to pass it back up to the parent component to go finish its job. In this case, I passed in 2 functions. So I'm doing a little bit of type evaluation here to say, like, what did I pass you? If I passed you a function, go call the success function back on the consumer of this component. Because the callback remembers its context, I still have reference to the component and the event and the helper that started this whole thing, so I can go back in and now set attributes. I tried in vain and did really stupid things, trying to pass the components in and out of the callback, and just terrible things happened. The Lightning framework didn't like it at all, so don't do that. That's actually what led me down to this path. Just know that the context is retained, and I can call my components, events, and helpers from within my callback functions. If I had an error, down below here, same thing. I'm going to call into the, if I had an error and I pass in a function, I'll just have the function back on the parent component handle that. Again, super lazy. We'll just write it to the log and pretend like nothing happened. So that's a proxy component, and that's a whirlwind tour of callbacks in a nutshell with the Lightning framework. Really, at the end of the day, callbacks are how Lightning and Apex talk to each other, and enqueueAction is the highway between the two. Callback hell sucks. You can get yourself buried 3 levels deep. I showed you a really contrived example, but you know, I've created accounts and then contacts and then opportunities and then opportunity contact roles and then opportunity accounts, yada, yada, yada. You can find yourself buried in piles of Lightning code just like you could in Apex and Visual Force. So let's try to flatten that stuff, let those callbacks handle things at a higher level than trying to pass things in at lower levels. I love this proxy thing. This is the best example of it I've come up with so far. I'm sure there's others, but the point is, like, you know, find a pattern you got to run and do over and over again, never have to write it again. Okay, so we talked about callbacks up to this point. Our Apex proxy function's cool because I can pass functions into it and have those get executed based on the success or failure of the call out. But let's talk a little bit about events now. So events in Lightning basically allow components to broadcast data when something happens, and allows other components to listen for that data when that event happens somewhere else. So we can stop tightly coupling our components to make things a little bit looser, and just kind of every component sits and waits for someone to talk, and then they choose whether or not they want to listen. The age-old question, do you use a component event or an application event? There's 2 flavors in Lightning. I like to think about it in terms of who's talking to who. Component events to me are like family talking really privately. It's sort of the events can talk up and down the component hierarchy, but they don't bust out of the hierarchy, so you don't have to worry about data leaking all over the place. Application events are the total opposite. They stand on the street corner and scream and shout to anyone who's willing to listen, which is great for setting up kind of a publish and subscribe model. If I've got a component that I want anybody who cares to listen to respond to, works good. Downside is you got data going all over the place. If you've got this event listening for that event, listens for this event, then you know the whole thing's going to explode, and you know everyone just get lost in waiting to listen to each other's events. So application events are cool, but put some guardrails up so things don't get out of control. So let's take a look at some events in the context of our Apex proxy. I glossed over this at the beginning. I've got 2 events out here that my Apex proxy is ready to listen, or ready to broadcast. We've got an Apex proxy application event, and then we've got an Apex proxy component event. And that Apex proxy component event is attached to an event called onComplete. Let's take a look at the application event first. This is what an event looks like in Lightning. It's basically a data structure that you define so that others listening for it know what to expect that they're going to get back. So at the application level, we're going to pass a title, just a unique string that lets the consumer know this is what I'm doing. We're going to pass some data, very generic. Whatever gets passed back is going to come across in this attribute. And then we've got an extra error object here. So if something goes wrong, it's a little easier to see that it was successful or it wasn't successful by evaluating the data attribute versus the error attribute. And the error attribute might look significantly different than the actual data that you're getting back. So over here in my Apex proxy, I'm declaring this here, and then here's an example consuming that and using the application event. So again, I've got my Apex proxy on the page here, and I've got an event handler here that's ready and waiting for this Apex proxy to broadcast. And this is within my parent component, and its method is here. Nothing special, just waiting to set a parameter or set an attribute, but obviously you could do whatever you want in this. Then back here in Apex proxy land, actually let me show you how we actually consume this. So here in my consumer that's passing an application event, I'm finding that Apex proxy again. This looks like our last example. Finding the method. Oops, I'm so sorry, I was on the wrong screen here. Here we go. That looks better. Boom. Okay, shortened version. Find my Apex proxy component, find the action I want to pass it, find the parameters I want to pass to it, then make my call. The difference here, instead of passing a function for my success as a callback and a function for my error as a callback, I'm just going to pass two strings. These are the titles that get passed into those application events, so whoever's listening for it can evaluate that and say, what was this? Where did it come from? What should I do with it? And then one extra parameter we didn't talk about with Apex proxy at the start was this application or component flag. This is the event level that we want Apex proxy to broadcast when something happens. Back over here in helper, the second half of our success and error call or event responses evaluate to say, did you pass me a string when I was successful or when I was an error? If the answer is yes, did you pass me an event level that was application? If so, fire that application event, and anyone in the application that's along with this component can listen for that, for better or worse. If you pass you a component level event, fire that event and broadcast that only as high as the component hierarchy needs to or would allow me to. And just to kind of round this out, the component event looks very similar to the application event, same footprint, just handled in a different way. Really, just given a name so that we can distinguish the two within our component. And then an example of calling the component event. Oops. Is here. Almost everything identical. The only distinction is we're passing in this component flag instead of the application flag. And if I go take a look at the markup here, what's slightly different is instead of having that application event handler at the component level, I actually have a method on this component that I'm passing to the Apex proxy as its instruction for how to handle that onComplete event. And if I look at that, we can see here that this is ready and waiting to get that event. In this example, I'm pulling out the data and setting it somewhere. So really, Apex proxy can handle functions, success and failure, can handle application events, technically success and failure. It's just going to pass what it gets back, but has that flexibility to operate at the application or the component level. So I think events really help promote flatness too. Again, they decouple our components from one another. They can just sit and listen and shout when they need to, when there's something important that they've got going on and someone else wants to listen. Component events, again, I think they work good locally in the tree. If you want to talk up or down your component hierarchy, use component events. If you want to talk across your component hierarchy within your entire application, use application events, sort of a publish-subscribe model again. With great power comes great responsibility. Don't get carried away and let too many application events be firing, or everybody's gonna, it'll be like a shouting match basically between your components. Then finally, so callbacks and events really do make the Lightning world go round. I think I mentioned earlier that I tried to do some really dumb stuff with the framework by passing in the component object and the event object to other things and trying to get it back, and it just wouldn't maintain state. It wouldn't yield the results I was expecting. And the fact is, I was doing it the hard way. There really is a Lightning way of doing things, and callbacks and events are really the path to that. I think both callbacks and events help promote this flatness concept. We don't get deeply nested code. We're not expecting things to be values to be passed into one object and back out of another. Things are just kind of waiting to listen. Or if I want to pass in a callback to something, I've got that all encapsulated, and I don't have to worry about going 6 levels deep. I can actually just keep calling up to the top level of my helper instead of having to go deep with my callbacks. I do think that component events are a little safer than application events, but you don't have to hate on them quite as much as some people do. Don't forget that events can take parameters, as we showed. I like to keep my events super generic. Like I had a component event and an application event, and then just kept the attributes that are passed into them relatively simple, just objects and text. That way you don't end up with a Lightning project that's got 46 very specific events. I favor to just have some generic events and pass those titles in, so I don't have to keep inventing new events within my apps. Some definitions for you all made up by me, who's semi-good and intelligent at this stuff, but there's probably smarter people out there that have ideas here as well. I have exactly 3 seconds for questions, but I'd be happy to hang out with you after the session. Thank you all for coming.